that they require regular access not just to a huge swath of territory, but to the entire globe. The central defining trait in all this work is safe, cheap transport. Inhibit that, and the rest of everything simply falls apart. While industrial technology's ease of adoption enabled them to spread easily, the reverse is also true. After all, there is very little skill capacity within the population that might enable it to maintain the contemporary world's flavor of industrialization should today's omnipresent transport links break apart for any reason. The workforce is alternatively hyper-specialized, nearly unskilled, or, testament to the fact that the world is nearly always stranger than you think, a combination of the two. Even worse, modern city life requires ever-present access to so many peoples and places scattered around the world, and over which a city has no influence. Put simply, regions can de-industrialize far more quickly than they industrialized, and the critical factor is what happens to transport. Deindustrialization could happen far more quickly than you think. Consider those big, fat, slow ships. Quick war story. In this case, the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s. By 1983, the conflict had reached a stalemate, inducing both countries to fling missiles at one another's shipping in attempts to strangle their opponent economically. Altogether, some 300 vessels were struck. About 50 were disabled, and a dozen sunk. Compared to the size of global shipping at the time, it was barely a footnote. But that handful of events nearly destroyed the global insurance sector. The American security guarantee for shipping was considered ironclad. After all, there had been less than a handful of incidents globally for decades. There was even a period from roughly 1950 to 1975 with 0 attacks on shipping. Loss provisions on maritime insurance, therefore, were at most minimal. Preparing for such incidents with large sums of cash would have been like setting aside billions to address earthquake claims in Illinois. But when the claims from the Iran-Iraq War rolled in, insurance firms quickly ran out of operating capital. So they filed claims with their reinsurance firms, who quickly ran dry as well. Suddenly, all insurance companies discovered that their entire industry teetered on the precipice. Fire insurance, car insurance, mortgage insurance, health insurance, it didn't matter. And with most insurance firms being linked to most bond markets via large financial houses, catastrophe loomed. The only thing that prevented a broad-scale global financial breakdown was the Reagan administration's 3-part decision to A. physically escort non-Iranian shipping in the Persian Gulf, B. reflag all such shipping as American vessels, and C. provide a blanket sovereign indemnity to all such shipping. A local military spat between a pair of non-merchant powers that didn't even have financial sectors quickly spiraled up to the point that only a superpower had the military, financial, and legal strength to prevent a global financial meltdown. Imagine if a similar event were to occur today. From 1970 through 2008, the Americans nearly always had a carrier group in the Persian Gulf, and since the 1991 Desert Storm conflict, typically 2. Escorting commercial shipping in 1983 merely required a few changes to patrol patterns. But since 2015, it has become normal for the Americans to go months at a time without ships of size in region at all. By the end of 2021, the Americans had removed all regular ground troops from the region as a whole. Absent the United States, there are only a handful of powers, France, the United Kingdom, Japan, and China, who could even reach the Persian Gulf with military assets. Of them, only Japan has the technical capacity to act in force, and none have the vessels required to establish meaningful convoys. Imagine if the ships in question were container ships instead of bulkers. One ship would hold thousands of containers containing tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of products. In the 1980s event, even those ships sunk were in time refloated and continued on with their lives. There is no way that would happen to a modern containerized cargo. Besides, would you buy a computer if a piece of the motherboard had sat on the bottom of the Gulf for a few days? Imagine if such an event occurred in a different location. Iran and Iraq in the 1980s were the ultimate no-value-added economies. Starkly limited local consumption, no participation in manufacturing supply systems. What if shipping was struck in the Baltic Sea or the East China Sea, places central to European and Asian manufacturing? Modern container ships do not take single products from one port to another, but instead run circuits. They travel to multiple ports, picking up and dropping off containers filled with a dizzying variety of products as they go. If any single ship is unable to transport or disgorge its cargo, impacts cascade throughout hundreds to thousands of supply chains across multiple industries and multiple regions. Even brief delays at only a handful of ports would be sufficient to force a rationalization of entire industries, to say nothing of actually losing ships. As the saying goes, it takes 30,000 pieces to make a car. If you only have 29,999 pieces, you've got an ambitiously sized paperweight. Imagine if such an event were not a one-off. The scale of 1983 versus 2022 is radically different. Between more differentiated supply chains, more wealth, and more countries, the total value of today's global seaborne cargo is now 6 times larger. Back-of-the-envelope math using data from throughout the past quarter millennia suggests that reducing transport costs by 1% results in an increase of trade volumes by about 5%. One doesn't need to run that in reverse for long before the trade-empowered modern world fades into a treasured memory. Bottom line, the world we know is eminently fragile, and that's when it's working to design. Today's economic landscape isn't so much dependent upon as it is eminently addicted to American strategic and tactical overwatch. Remove the Americans, and long-haul shipping degrades from being the norm to being the exception. Remove mass consumption due to demographic collapses, and the entire economic argument for mass integration collapses. One way or another, our normal is going to end. The most miraculous, and to a degree unexpected outcome of the American-led order is the extent to which it transformed areas that had rarely, if ever, been participants in any large-scale, multi-state trading system. Most of the world does not enjoy a geographic setup that naturally encourages economic activity, like the temperate climates or the dense river networks common to Western Europe or North America. The order made geography matter less. The Americans would now protect your borders, as well as your external commerce. Such a structure enabled geographies that had never developed before, or that had been crushed under the boot of this or that empire, to rise up as independent players. The greatest economic growth humanity has seen in the time since 1945 has been base effect growth within these until recently neglected and until recently economically defunct geographies. That means as the Americans descend into a mindset of not my pig, not my farmism, the greatest propensity for disruption and the greatest impacts of those disruptions will not only be in the same locations, they will be in the same new locations. The first of these soon-to-be crazy geographies are the territories on and coastward of Asia's first island chain, a region that includes Japan, China, Korea, and Taiwan, and to a lesser degree the Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Singapore. What resources exist gradually peter out as one travels from south to north, while the value and volume of manufacturing tends to follow the opposite gradient. It is a natural area of intense competition characterized by concentrated resource demand, the longest supply lines on Earth, and massive export dependency. The result? Intermediate goods everywhere, with all of them being shipped by water. This combination of vulnerability and integration could have only occurred in a security environment in which an external power forced everyone to play nice. Yet even with American overwatch, East Asia never developed a regional system of cooperation, or even diplomatic pressure release valves that fall short of military exchange. China hates Japan. Japan, perhaps now subconsciously, wants to colonize Korea and parts of China. Taiwan wants a nuclear deterrent, and the South Koreans trust no bitch. Even worse, with the notable exception of Japan, none of the local powers has the ability to secure its own supply or trade lines. It is difficult to evaluate who is in a worse position. South Korea and Taiwan, who suffer a near-complete dependence upon American strategic naval overwatch, or China, who would have to punch through the waters of multiple hostile combatants, including all the countries of the chain, as well as a half dozen more choke points to reach any market or resource access that matters, using a navy that is largely only capable of coastal operations. Okay, never mind. I take it back. It's totally worse for China. Chinese fascism has worked to this point. But between a collapse of domestic consumption due to demographic aging, a loss of export markets due to deglobalization, and an inability to protect the imports of energy